Hey guys, my name's Daniel. Welcome back to NYC. I hope you all have been having a good week. And if you're new here, thank you for showing up and we hope to see you in the future. So last week we talked about the woman at the well and how Jesus had a conversation with her, and through that conversation, she was able to bring more people to Christ. This week we'll talk about how Moses was used by God to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. So a little bit of a background before we jump right into it. The Pharaoh did not like the Israelites. In fact, he feared them. He feared them so much that he decided to put them into slavery. He thought that if they were to rebel or to stage an uprising against him, he would be threatened, and his power and his position as Pharaoh would be threatened. So we'll read Exodus chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. It says, "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Rameses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So the premise of that is, even though they were under ruthless labor and they were burdened with the slavery, they continued to multiply. And this only caused more fear in the Pharaoh's heart. And this eventually pushed him to order all the Israelites to throw their newborn boys into the Nile River. He thought if he was able to do this, that the population of the Israelites wouldn't become too overwhelming and he would still be able to maintain his power as Pharaoh. But in a tribe of Levi, not that far away, a woman decided not to throw her baby in the Nile River. She decided to keep him and to raise him for 3 months until she couldn't no longer. This baby was Moses, and she wasn't able to keep him no longer, so she decided to put him in a basket and float him down the Nile River. She had her daughter look at the basket to make sure it didn't get into any danger, and soon the basket reached the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh's daughter decided to open the basket, and she saw Moses, and she wanted to keep Moses. So she went to the daughter and she says, "Have your mom nurture this child so when it's of age I can adopt it." So soon she adopts the child, and Moses is basically being raised by the Egyptian princess. So we'll stop right there for a little second. Moses is broken from his Israelite family. He's being raised by Egyptians and seeing his own people being tormented and being ruthlessly labored by the Egyptians. So as Moses is growing up, he's seeing his own people being worked and worked and worked, and soon he's had enough. So we are going to read from Exodus 2, chapter 11, no, verses 11 through 13. It says, "One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, looking this way and that, seeing no one. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?' The man said, 'Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'What I did must have become known.' And it did become known. In fact, the Pharaoh finds out and he wants to kill Moses. So Moses flees to Midian, a place not that far away, and he decides to live there and wait for the Pharaoh to die. And soon the Pharaoh does die. But while he's in Midian, he gets accustomed to living in Midian, and he gets a family. He has a wife, he has some kids, and he has a father-in-law. So while he's tending his father-in-law's sheep, he soon discovers the voice of God in a bush with a flame in the center, but the bush isn't burning. That's what he discovers, and he finds it amazing. And that brings us to our first point. Our first point is, your past does not define what God has in store for your future. So we can see that Moses left Egypt and leaves all of that behind, and he aims to create a new life for him. He even has a family, he has a wife, he has some kids, and he decides to leave Egypt and has no intention of going back. But God goes to Moses and says, I want you to free my people of Israel out of Egypt. So sometimes we can feel that God won't use us because we've done something super bad in the past, we've sinned in the past, or we're just not qualified enough to do what he asks. But God knows what we're able to do. He's created us. He knows our hearts, he knows our minds, he knows our capabilities. So it's just very important that you remember that God knows us more than we truly know ourselves. After Moses finds out that he is told to free the people of Israel, God tells him to do some instructions. So Moses goes to Egypt and he decides to follow suit with God's instructions. But before that, there was some hesitancy. Moses didn't want to do it. He didn't feel confident in his abilities to go to Egypt and free the people of Egypt. But that's when we're reminded that God is our God. He's powerful. He's amazing. Amazing God with amazing power. So Moses goes to Egypt and he does the miraculous works God tells him to do in front of the Israelites. And through this, he thinks he would be able to free the Israelites and bring them out of slavery. But it's not that simple. The Pharaoh sees this and he decides to put the Israelites under more pressure, under more labor, and he decides to just make it seen that you will not get saved by this God. And that brings us to point 2. Not all of God's plans are one-time trials. Sometimes when God gives us plans, we think it's just going to be a one and done experience. But God usually has things we have to do before the amazing things he has us to do in the future. So don't feel discouraged if it feels like you're not going to be done with God's trials, because God has a ultimate goal for us and he has a step-by-step process he wants us to go through. So after the Pharaoh decides to put the Israelites under more pressure, Moses comes back and says, God says, let my people go, or there will be punishments and there will be things that to be wary of. And soon the Pharaoh decides not to listen, and God does follow suit, and he puts plagues across of Egypt. Through the plagues, the Pharaoh decides to let the Israelites go, and they were free. Soon after that, they regret their decision, and they try to chase after the Israelites, but they weren't able to catch them because Moses had split the Nile River in half to let the Israelites cross, and then he closed it when the Egyptians were about to cross. And that brings us to our last point. God's plans are absolute. God wanted the Israelites to be free, and he was able to get them free. Moses got the Israelites free because that was God's plan. And through that plan, he was able to truly reach God's purpose. And sometimes we feel that the plans God has for us are impossible and that we're not qualified. But we are, because God knows us and he knows the future he has for us. So before we end this, I want to let you ask yourself, how can God use you to glorify his kingdom? And also, how can God use your gifts to bring others to Christ?